Section 9 of the Sexes in Science and History by Eliza Burt Gamble. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, Prehistoric Society, Chapter 4, The Origin of Marriage. Quote, I will be master of what is mine own. She is my goods, my chattels. She is my house, my household stuff, my field, my barn, my horse, my ox, my ass, my everything. Unquote. The Taming of the Shrew. It is an obvious fact that so far as her sex relations are concerned, the position of civilized woman is lower than that of the female animal. The question which presents itself at this stage of our inquiry is what were the causes which led to the overthrow of female supremacy, or what were the processes by which man gained the undisputed right to the control of woman's person. By contrasting the industrial position of women under Gentile institutions with that of later times, after they had become the sexual slaves of men, it will be seen that the question of economics is deeply involved in this change. Although the early independence of women is now recognized, the fact of their industrial supremacy is for the most part ignored. Indeed, the part performed by women in originating and developing human industries is seldom referred to by those dealing with this subject. As the activities best suited to the tastes of primitive man were confined to war and the chase, those occupations and pursuits which were necessary for the preservation of the group were carried on by women. The reason for this is obvious. Fathers were not regarded as being related to their offspring. The mother was the only recognized parent. As the land was held in common, women were economically free. They were absolutely independent of men for their support. Under these conditions, the importance of women's position may be easily perceived. Not only did women establish the first industries, but they invented and constructed the tools and implements by which these industries were carried on. Women were the first tillers of the soil. It was they who conceived the idea of preserving seeds whereby farinaceous food might be produced. Corn was not only raised by them, but by them it was ground and further prepared for use. They built clay granaries in which to store their food products and tamed the cat to protect them. Implements for tilling the soil and devices for grinding the grain were invented by women. They were the first architects and the first builders. They first conceived the idea of making cloth with which to protect the body. They were the first spinners and the first weavers. They invented the first spindles and the first looms. Their attempts at decoration were the beginning of art. As these pioneers in industry were without means of transportation other than their backs, some of the difficulties which they encountered may be readily perceived. It must be borne in mind that for primitive women there was no accumulated store of knowledge and no previous race experiences, neither were there any established rules or precedents to guide them. All methods and utilities had to be worked out by woman's unaided brain. When the conditions under which these pioneers in industry labored are considered, and when one reflects on the obstacles which must have presented themselves at every step along their untried pathway, it would almost seem that their early achievements were quite as remarkable as are those which have since been accomplished by men. The fact is observed that woman assumed the role of protector and provider, not as is commonly asserted because she was compelled by man to become a beast of burden, but because she was the recognized guardian not only of infant life, but of the public welfare. Later, after the primitive groups began to coalesce to form the tribe, after wife capture became prevalent and men thereby secured the right to the control and ownership of individual women, a right which they still claim, then, and not till then, did women become beasts of burden. Then, and not till then, did man gain the right to the control of woman's person. It is now known that wife capture is the origin of our present form of marriage, and that the establishment of the family with man on its head rests on the same basis. It is also known that through forcible marriage and the economic conditions which it entailed, woman became a dependent, a mere appendage to her male mate. The dominion of man and the assumed inferiority of woman are the direct results of the authority which he was able to exercise over her in the marital relation. We have seen that prior to the decline of female influence, women taken prisoners in war were not regarded as the legitimate property of their captors. On the contrary, female captives were adopted into the gens and invested with the same status of personal independence enjoyed by the original members of the group. Later, however, female prisoners began to be regarded as the special booty of their captors and as belonging exclusively to them. And although in primitive times marriage outside the limits of related groups was prohibited, owing to the esteem in which military chieftains came to be held, this claim was at length allowed them. Any courageous young warrior, conscious of his popularity, might gather about him a band of his clansmen and march against a neighboring tribe, the women taken prisoners during such expeditions being the special prizes of their captors. These prisoners were entitled to none of the privileges of the community into which they were taken, and as the hostility felt toward unrelated tribes had become so strong as to be shared by women, the captive woman could no longer look for pity even from her own sex. From this time in the history of the race may be traced the decline of woman's power and the subjection of the natural female impulses. As at this stage, within the limits of their own tribe, women held the balance of power in their own hands, and as they still exercised unqualified control over their own persons, the acknowledged ownership of one woman, who being a stranger was without power or influence, would be an object much to be desired, and one for which a warrior would not hesitate to brave the dangers of a hostile camp. Hence female captives were in demand, and the women of warring tribes were sought after singly and in groups. In process of time, wars for wives became general, and under the new regime women had the fear of captivity constantly before their view as a condition more to be dreaded than death. In the Mahabharata of India, it is stated that formerly women were unconfined and roved about at their pleasure, independent. Finally, marriage was instituted, and a woman was bound to a man for life. One of the 8 forms of legalized marriage in the Code of Manu was that of capture de facto and was called Rakshasa. This particular form of conjugal union was practiced exclusively by the military classes, among which the women taken in battle were the acknowledged booty of their captors. A definition of this kind of marriage is as follows: the seizure of a maiden by force from her house while she weeps and calls for assistance after her kinsmen and friends have been slain in battle or wounded, and their house is broken open, is the marriage called Rakshasa. Capture as the prescribed form of marriage for warriors may be traced through thousands of years and among various peoples. Of the 3 legalized forms of marital union in Rome, that by capture was the one in use among the plebeians, the patricians at the same time practicing confarreatio and usus. In Arabia, as late as Mohammed's time, the carrying off of women was recognized as a legal form of marriage. That capture constituted a legal form of marriage among the Israelites, or that women taken captives in war were appropriated as sexual slaves, is shown by the religious history in which the instructions given to the Lord's chosen people after they had taken a city was to smite every male thereof with the edge of the sword. But the women and the little ones and the cattle and all that is in the city they were to take unto themselves. This, it will be noticed, is to be done unto the cities which are very far off, and which are not of the cities of these nations. When the Israelites, 12,000 strong, marched against the Midianites, they were commanded by Moses to slay all the males, adults, and children, and all the women except the virgins. These virgins, of whom there were 32,000, were to be spared and utilized as wives by the victorious Israelites. The fact will be noted that these women had been taken from their own people, hence they were wholly without influence or power. They were dependents and therefore subject to the will of their masters. They were sexual slaves or wives. In Australia, among the North American Indians, the tribes of the Amazon and the Orinoco, in Hindustan and Afghanistan, marriage by actual capture is still practiced, and many of the details connected with the modus operandi have been given by various writers. The following from Sir George Grey, relative to this form of marriage as it exists at the present time among some of the native Australian tribes, is quoted by Mr. J. F. McLennan. Although a woman gives no encouragement to her admirers, many plots are laid to carry her off, and in the encounters which result from these, she is almost certain to receive some violent injury, for each of the combatants orders her to follow him, and in the event of her refusing, throws a spear at her. The early life of a young woman, at all celebrated for beauty, is generally one continued series of captivity to different masters, of ghastly wounds, of wanderings in strange families, of rapid flights, of bad treatment from other females, amongst whom she is brought a stranger by her captor, and rarely do you see a form of unusual grace and elegance, but it is marked and scarred by the furrows of old wounds, and many a female thus wanders several hundred miles from the home of her infancy, being carried off successively to distant and more distant points. In an account describing the search for wives by the natives of Sydney, Collins says, "The poor wretch is stolen upon in the absence of her protectors, being first stupefied with blows, inflicted with clubs or wooden swords, on the head, back, and shoulders, every one of which is followed by a stream of blood. She is then dragged through the woods by one arm, with a perseverance and violence that it might be supposed would displace it from its socket. This outrage is not resented by the relations of the female, who only retaliate by a similar outrage when they find an opportunity. This is so constantly the practice among them that even the children make it a play game or exercise." By various travellers and explorers, the fact has been observed that certain symbols representing force in their marriage ceremonies are in use among nearly, if not all, extant tribes which have reached a certain stage of growth. To such an extent in an earlier age has the forcible carrying off of women prevailed, that among most of these tribes a valid marriage may not be consummated without the appearance of force in the nuptial ceremonies. In reference to these symbols, we have the following passage from Mr. McLennan. "Meantime, we observe that whenever we discover symbolical forms, we are justified in inferring that in the past life of the people employing them there were corresponding realities. And if, among the primitive races which we examine, we find such realities as might naturally pass into such forms on an advance taking place in civility, then we may safely conclude, keeping within the conditions of a sound inference, that what these now are, those employing the symbols once were." Among primitive tribes, the area controlled by each was small, therefore vigilance in maintaining their possessions was one of their chief duties, and hostility to surrounding tribes a natural condition. Subsequently, however, when friendly relations began to be established with hitherto hostile tribes, they are found entering into negotiations to furnish each other with wives. It was at this time that marriage by sale or contract was instituted, an arrangement by which the elder men in the tribe could be accommodated with foreign wives, at the same time that their own daughters and sisters became to them a source of revenue. In Uganda, many men obtain wives by exchanging daughters and sisters with each other. Of this practice, C. Staniland Wake says, "This is not an unusual mode of proceeding in different parts of the world. The perpetuation of the monopoly of women enjoyed to a great extent by the older men of the tribe among the Australians is, according to Mr. Howitt, encouraged by those having sisters or daughters to exchange with each other for wives. Not unfrequently, actual capture is practiced side by side with fiction, violent seizure being in active operation among the same tribes at the same time with the symbol, the frequency of actual violence depending partly on the extent to which hostility prevails between the tribes and partly on the degree of uniformity established by usage in the prices paid for wives. Among certain tribes, when a dispute arises concerning the price to be paid for a bride, if the man is able to seize the woman and carry her off to his tent, the law recognizes her as his wife, and nothing is left for the relations to do in the matter but to accept his terms as to the price. The peoples among which actual capture is at present practiced, and those among which wives are procured by sale or contract, represent two different stages in the development of the institution of marriage. And it is owing to this fact that the symbols used among the latter may be traced to the realities in which they originated. Of the Bedouins of Mount Sinai, Baghdad says that marriage is a matter of sale and purchase, in which the inclination of the girl is disregarded. The young maid comes home in the evening with the cattle. At a short distance from the camp, she is met by the future spouse and a couple of his young friends, and carried off by force to her father's tent. If she entertains any suspicion of their designs, she defends herself with stones, and often inflicts wounds on the young men, even though she does not dislike the lover, for, according to custom, the more she struggles, bites, kicks, cries, and shrieks, the more she is applauded ever after by her own companions. In reference to the Mazain Arabs, the same writer observes that a similar custom prevailed within the limits of the Sinai Peninsula, but not among the other tribes of that province. A girl, having been wrapped in the Abba at night, is permitted to escape from her tent and fly into the neighboring mountains. The bridegroom goes in search of her next day, and remains often many days before he can find her out, while her female friends are apprised of her hiding place and furnish her with provisions. If the husband finds her at last, which is sooner or later according to the impression that he has made upon the girl's heart, he is bound to consummate the marriage in the open country and to pass the night with her in the mountains. The next morning the bride goes home to her tent, that she may have some food, but again runs away in the evening and repeats this flight several times, till she finally returns to her tent. She does not go to live in her husband's tent until she is far advanced in pregnancy. If she does not become pregnant, she may not join her husband till a full year from the wedding day. Krantz says that in Greenland, some females, when a husband is proposed to them, will fall into a swoon, elope to a desert place, or cut off their hair. In the latter case, they are seldom troubled with further addresses. The refractory bride is dragged forcibly into her suitor's house, where she sits for several days disconsolate with dishevelled hair and refuses nourishment. When friendly exhortations are unavailing, she is compelled by force and even with blows to receive her husband. Should she elope, she is brought back and treated more harshly than before. Wherever friendly relations have been established between the tribe of the wife and that of the husband, he pays a price to her relatives for the privilege of removing her to his camp. This purchase price, together with the simulated hatred of the woman's friends, signifies a sacrifice on the part of the wife and her family. In Nubia, when a man marries, he presents his wife with a wedding dress and gives her also a pledge for 300 or 400 piastres, half of which sum is paid her in case of a divorce. Divorces, however, are very rare. Among the Circassians, after the preliminaries have been settled by the parents, the lover meets his bride-elect by night in some secluded spot, and with the assistance of 2 or 3 of his best friends, seizes her and carries her away. Sometimes the pretended capture takes place in the midst of a noisy feast. The woman is usually conducted into the presence of a mutual friend, where, on the following day, her friends, simulating anger, seek her and demand a reason for her abduction. Although the affair is usually settled at once by the bridegroom paying the accustomed price for his bride, custom requires that there shall be still further manifestations of anger on the part of her friends. So, on the following day, all the relatives of the bride, armed with sticks, proceed to the place where the bride is in waiting, there to meet the bridegroom and his friends, who have come to carry off the bride. A sham fight ensues, in which the bridegroom and his party are always victorious. Among certain of the Arabian tribes, the bridegroom must force his bride to enter his tent, and in France, as late as the 17th century, a similar custom prevailed. In describing a wedding dance in Abyssinia, Parkins observes: "This dance is performed by men armed with shields and lances, who, with bounds, feints, and springs, attack others armed with guns, so as to approach them and at the same time avoid their fire, while the gunners make similar demonstrations, and at last fire off their guns either in the air or into the earth, and then, drawing their swords, flourish them about as a finish. Finally, the bridegroom fires off a gun and immediately rushes across to where the bride and her female relations are stationed." Taylor informs us that a Scandinavian warrior generally sought to gain his bride by force, that he conceived it beneath his dignity to win her by pacific means. That the affair might appear more heroic, he waited until the object of his choice was about to wed another, and was actually on her way to the nuptial ceremony when, with his friends, he would surprise the wedding cortege, seize the bride, and carry her off. It has been said of Scandinavian marriages that they were matters of deep anxiety to the friends both of the bride and groom, who, until the wedding was over, remained at home in suspense, fearing an attack of the kind already mentioned. It was customary for a party of young men to station themselves at the church door and, as soon as the ceremony was completed, to carry the news to the homes of the wedded pair. Within a few generations the same old practice was kept up in Wales, where the bridegroom and his friends, mounted and armed as for war, carried off the bride, and in Ireland they used even to hurl spears at the bride's people, though at such a distance that no one was hurt. In the Amazon valley the bride is always carried away by violence. Among the Zulus, although a purchase price is paid for a woman, custom requires that a wife, after having been captured, shall make 3 attempts to return to her own home. Of the marriage customs in ancient Sparta, Plutarch says, "In their marriages the bridegroom carried off the bride by violence." In Rome we have the familiar example of the Sabine women, who were captured or carried off by force. A notable fact in connection with the subject of capture is that the mother of the bride, or in case the mother is dead, the nearest female relative, is the individual who assumes the part of the principal defender in this ceremony. She it is who attempts to rescue the bride, and who, more than any other, mourns the fate of the captured wife. Among primitive peoples, with the exception of the symbol of wife capture in marriage ceremonies, there is perhaps none more significant than that typifying the hatred of the mother for the captor of her daughter. Customs indicating estrangement or actual aversion to sons-in-law usually, if not always, accompany marriage by capture. The fact that the change in the relative positions of the sexes, as indicated by the Sadika and Baal forms of marriage in Arabia, was not easily or speedily accomplished, is apparent not only in the symbols of wife capture everywhere practiced among peoples in a certain stage of development, but is strongly suggested also by the aversion found to exist among these same peoples between mothers-in-law and sons-in-law, whether appearing as a reality or as a symbol. Among the Arawaks of South America it is unlawful for the son-in-law to look upon the face of his mother-in-law. If they live in the same house a partition separates them, and if by chance they must enter the same boat, she must precede him so as to keep her back toward him. Among the Caribs all the women talk with whom they will, but the husband dares not converse with his wife's relations except on extraordinary occasions. Mr. Tyler refers to the fact that in the account of the Floridian expedition of Alvar Nunez, commonly known as Cabeca de Vaca, or Cow's Head, it is mentioned that the parents-in-law did not enter the son-in-law's house, nor he theirs, nor his brother-in-law's, and if they met by chance, they went a backshot out of their way, with their heads down and eyes fixed on the ground, for they held it a bad thing to see or speak to one another. It is observed by Richardson, an author quoted by Taylor, that among the Crees, while an Indian lives with his wife's family, his mother-in-law must not speak to or look at him. In some portions of Australia, the mother-in-law does not allow the son-in-law to see her, but hides herself if he is near, and if she has to pass him, makes a circuit, keeping carefully concealed within her cloak. Among some of the tribes in Central Africa, from the moment a marriage is contracted, the lover may not behold the parents of his future bride. When a young man wishes to marry a girl, he dispatches a messenger to negotiate with her parents regarding the presents required and the number of oxen demanded. This being arranged, he may not again look upon the father and mother of his intended wife. He takes the greatest care to avoid them, and if by chance they perceive him, they cover their faces as if all ties of friendship were broken. We are told, however, that this indifference is only feigned, that they feel the same friendship as before, and in conversation extol one another's merit. Mr. Cayley says that this custom extends beyond the relations. If the lover is of a different camp, he must avoid all the inhabitants of the lady's camp except a few intimate friends who are permitted to assist him in his love-making. A little tent is set up for him in the neighborhood, under which he is to remain during the day. If he has occasion to cross the camp, he must cover his face. He may not see the face of his intended throughout the day, but at nightfall he may creep silently to her tent and remain with her until the dawn. These clandestine visits are continued for a month or two, when the marriage is solemnized. At the wedding festival the women collect round the bride, singing her praises and extolling her virtues. A gubernatis is authority for the statement that in many parts of Italy the bride is compelled to go through the process of weeping on her wedding day, also for the fact that one of the marriage customs prevalent in Sardinia is identical with that which appeared among the plebeians at Rome, namely, the pretense of tearing the bride from the arms of her mother. From the facts which have been obtained relative to the practice of wife capture, it is only natural to suppose that the mother of the captured wife would be her chief ally and defender. That such has been the case seems to be clearly shown by the symbols of distrust and aversion everywhere manifested between mothers-in-law and sons-in-law among the various existing uncivilized races. The practice of wife capture exists either as a reality or as a symbol entering into the marriage ceremonies among the tribes of Central Africa, the Indians of North and South America, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Arabia, in the hill tracts of India, among the Fuegians, and in the islands of the Pacific Ocean. And, wherever this system is found, the symbol of hatred between mother-in-law and son-in-law also prevails. The simulated anger and sham violence connected with marriage ceremonies among friendly peoples, which are so far removed from a time when actual capture was practiced as to be ignorant of the true significance of these symbols, show the extent to which marriage is based on the idea of force on the one side and unwilling submission on the other. As the numerous Arabian clans in the time of Mohammed represented the varying stages of advancement from the second period of barbarism to civilization, the constitution of Arab society at that time affords an excellent opportunity for observing the growth of the institution of marriage and the various processes by which the former supremacy of women was overthrown. One of the principal objects of war at the time of the Prophet is said to have been the capture of women for wives, a practice which was recognized as lawful. Under Islam, the custom of forcibly carrying off women for wives was universal and was carried on side by side with the system of marriage by contract or sale. The position of the captured woman, however, differed somewhat from that of the purchased wife, the former having been forcibly carried away from her home, lost the protection of her friends, while the purchased wife, although she relinquished the authority which had formerly been exercised by women within the gens, and although she surrendered her person to her lord, did not forfeit her right to the protection of her own family in case of abuse. Although in Arabia, under the form of marriage by sale or contract, the wife lost the right to the control of property belonging to her own gens, she did not, as in Rome, forfeit her claim to the protection of her kindred. If she received ill treatment within the home of her husband, her relatives, who were still her natural protectors, were bound to redress her wrongs. In Rome, on the contrary, under a system representing a later stage in the development of marriage, the wife was adopted into the stock of her husband, whose rights over her person were supreme, at the same time that her kindred renounced the right to interfere in her behalf. It is to the fact that in early Arabia the wife never relinquished her hold upon her own relations that we are to look for an explanation of the high social position of Arabian women. We are assured that it is an old Arab sentiment and not Moslem, that women are entitled to the highest respect and that as mothers of the tribe they are its most sacred trust. According to Professor W.R. Smith, in Muhammad's time, in addition to the two forms of marriage mentioned, namely that by capture and that by sale or contract, there existed also a more ancient form known as the sadika, a form of conjugal union which was a remnant of the matriarchal system. By observing the facts connected with the last named institution, we shall be enabled to understand something of the position occupied by women during the earlier ages of human existence before wife capture became prevalent. Among certain tribes, just prior to Islam, upon the event of marriage, the man presented the woman with a sum of money, which offering was simply an acknowledgment of the favor which she was conferring upon him. The husband went to live with the wife in her tent, and as the contract was for no specified length of time, he was at liberty to go whenever he tired of the conditions imposed on him by his wife and her relations. Any children, however, that were born as a result of this union belonged to the mother and became members of her hai. If she desired him to go, she simply turned the tent around, so that if the door had faced east, it now faced west, and when the man saw this, he knew that he was dismissed and did not enter. In relation to these marriage customs, Professor Smith says, "Here, therefore, we have the proof of a well-established custom of that kind of marriage which naturally goes with female kinship in the generation immediately before Islam. Of this kind of marriage the same writer observes, the Mota marriage was a purely personal contract, founded on consent between a man and a woman, without any intervention on the part of the woman's kin. Now the fact that there was no contract with the woman's kin, such as was necessary when the wife left her own people and came under the authority of her husband, and that indeed her kin might know nothing about it, can have only one explanation. In Mota marriage the woman did not leave her home. Her people gave up no rights which they had over her, and the children of the marriage did not belong to the husband. Mota marriage, in short, is simply the last remains of that type of marriage which corresponds to a law of mother kinship, and Islam condemns it and makes it the sister of harlotry, because it does not give the husband a legitimate offspring, that is, an offspring that is reckoned to his own tribe and has rights of inheritance within it." Before the separation of the Hebrews and Arameans, the wife remained within her own tent, where she received her husband, the children of such unions taking her name and becoming her heirs. This kind of conjugal union is known to have been in existence in many portions of the world. In Ceylon it is designated as the Baena marriage. In ancient Arabia not only did women control their own homes, but they owned flocks and herds and were absolutely independent of male relations. As late as the 14th century of our era, although the women of certain Arabian tribes were willing to marry strangers, they never followed them to their homes. Among the Bedouins, it is a rare thing for a woman at marriage to leave her home and kindred. When a woman marries a man, he settles among her kinsmen, and as she presents him with a spear and a tent by way of dowry, it would seem that he is expected to join her relations and assist in the common defense. The marks of authority under Gentile rule are the possession of a tent and a lance, yet we find that these are the objects which, under matriarchal usages, the wife tenders her husband when he enters her family. The first doubtless as a symbol of her protection, the second as indicating her authority and the services which he is expected to render her and her people. Until a late period in Rome, it was the custom, during the solemnities of marriage, to pass a lance over the head of the wife in token of the power which the husband was about to gain over her. Under the two types of marriage, namely Mota and Baal, the positions of women were so diametrically opposed that both could not continue. Hence, when under the pressure brought to bear upon them, women began to accept the Baal form of marriage within their own hai, Mota unions were doomed. Of the more ancient form of marriage in Arabia, under which the woman chooses her mate, evidences of which are still extant in that country, and that by capture under which she becomes a slave of her lord, Professor Smith says, "There is, then, abundant evidence that the ancient Arabs practiced marriage by capture, and we see that the type of marriage so constituted is altogether different from those unions of which the Mota is a survival, and kinship through women the necessary accompaniment. In the one case the woman chooses and dismisses her husband at will, in the other she has lost the right to dispose of her person, and so the right of divorce lies only with the husband. In the one case the woman receives the husband in her own tent, among her own people, in the other she is brought home to his tent and people. In the one case the children are brought up under the protection of the mother's kin and are of her blood, in the other they remain with the father's kindred and are of his blood. All later Arabic marriages under the system of male kinship, whether constituted by capture or by contract, belong to the same type. In all cases, as we shall presently see in detail, the wife who follows her husband and bears children who are of his blood has lost the right freely to dispose of her person. The husband has authority over her, and he alone has the right of divorce. Accordingly, the husband in this kind of marriage is called, not in Arabia only, but also among the Hebrews and Arameans, the woman's lord, or owner, and whenever this name for husband is found, we may be sure that marriage is of the second type, with male kinship, and the wife bound to the husband and following him to his home. Notwithstanding the humane enactments of Mohammed in the interest of women, their position steadily declined, such enactments having been overbalanced by the establishment of marriages of dominion, by the growing idea that Sadika or Mota marriages were not respectable, and that women could not depend upon their relations to take their part against their husbands. The history of religion shows that its growth has always followed the same course as have the ideas concerning the relative importance of the sexes. The God idea and the fundamental doctrines of religion are always found to be in harmony with established principles and ideas relative to sex domination and superiority. The religion of Mohammed was essentially masculine, all its principles being in strict accord with male supremacy. It is not therefore singular that when the weight of religion was added to the already growing tendency toward Baal marriages, that Sadika marriages were doomed. In Arabia, as elsewhere, the duties of the purchased wife were specific. The present, which under the older form of marriage had been given to the bride as a love token, or as an acknowledgment of the husband's devotion to her, subsequently took the form of a purchase price, and was claimed by her father and brothers as a compensation for the loss sustained by the group through the removal of her offspring, whose services belonged to their mother's people. In other words, the husband paid a price to the wife's relations for the right to raise children by her which should belong exclusively to his kin, children which, should she remain within her own home, would belong to her kindred. The wife was therefore removed to the husband's hai, where, so far as the sexual relation was concerned, his rights over her were supreme. We have observed that wherever the possessions of the gens continued to be the property of all its members and were controlled by women, the man at marriage went to live with a woman. So soon, however, as men began to claim the soil and property began to accumulate in their hands, the wife went to reside with her husband and his family as a dependent. Among various tribes, the form of marriage in use depends on the means of the contracting parties. If the man is able to pay to the woman's father or brothers the full price charged for her, she goes to him as his slave. She is his property as much as is his dog or his gun. If, however, he is unable to pay the amount charged, he goes to live with her and her family and becomes their slave. In Japan, among the higher classes, upon the marriage of the eldest son, his bride accompanies him to his paternal home, but, on the other hand, when the eldest daughter marries, her husband takes up his abode with her parents. Eldest daughters always retain their own names, which their husbands are obliged to assume. As the wife of an eldest son becomes a member of her husband's family, and the husband of an eldest daughter joins the family of his wife and assumes her name, the eldest son of a family may not marry the eldest daughter of another family. Regarding the younger members of the household, if the husband's family provides the house, the wife takes his name, while if the bride's family furnishes the home, the bridegroom assumes the name of the wife. In the marriage customs of various nations, and in their ideas relative to the ownership and control of the home, may be observed something more than a hint of the principal causes underlying the decline of female power. Wherever women remain within their own homes or with their own relations, they are mistresses of the situation, but when they follow the fathers of their children to their homes, they become dependents and wholly subject to the will and pleasure of their husbands. It is plain, however, that under a system of marriage by sale or contract, although a woman might exercise little influence in the home of her husband, so long as her relations stood ready to defend her, she would enjoy an immunity from abuse. The fact that a woman can count upon her relations for protection against her husband shows plainly that in a certain stage of marriage by contract or sale, women are not the abject slaves which they have been represented to be. Although in the Fiji Islands a man may seize a woman and take her to his home, she does not remain with him unless agreeable to her inclinations. Amongst the Abipones, a man, on choosing a wife, bargains with her parents about the price, but it frequently happens that the girl rescinds what has been agreed upon between the parents and the bridegroom, obstinately rejecting the very mention of marriage. Among the Charruas of South America, divorce is quite optional. In Sumatra, if a man carries off a virgin against her will, he incurs a heavy fine. Or, if a man carries off a woman under pretense of marriage, he must lodge her immediately with some reputable family. Although in the earlier ages of marriage, by sale or contract, daughters were regarded as the property of their fathers, still that stage had not been reached at which women were accounted simply as sexual slaves. The Arabs practiced marriage by sale or contract, yet they jealously watched over their women. They defended them with their lives and eagerly redeemed them when they were taken captive. They thought it better to bury their daughters than to give them in marriage to unworthy husbands. According to the testimony of J. G. Wood, Kafir women are very tenacious about their relations. Probably it is thought for the reason that husbands are more respectful toward wives who have friends near them than they are to those who have no relations at hand to take their part. Usually among the Kafirs, according to Mr. Shooter, although a man pays a price to the parents of the woman whom he wishes to marry, the affair is by no means settled. On the contrary, he must undergo the closest scrutiny by her before she will consent to accept him. Bidding him stand, she surveys first one side of him, then the other, the relations in the meantime standing about awaiting her decision. Upon this subject Mr. Wood remarks: "This amusing ceremony has two meanings: the first, that the contract of marriage is a voluntary act on both sides, and the second, that the intending bridegroom has as yet no authority over her." Although under the system of marriage by sale or contract a woman has a voice in the selection of her husband, and although she can count on her kinsmen to protect her against abuse, still practically the contract brings the wife under the same condition as a captured wife. She follows her husband to his home, where, as a dependent, he exercises control over her person and her children. In Arabia, prior to the time of the Prophet, the wife could claim the protection of her kindred against her husband, yet the principle underlying marriage by contract and that by capture was the same, except that under the former the husband paid a price for the woman's sexual subjection, while under the latter, not only in sexual matters, but in all others as well, he was her lord and master. The Prophet says, "I charge you with your women, for they are with you as captives." Awani. Professor Smith informs us that according to the lexicons, awani is actually used in the same sense as married women generally. For long ages after Baal marriages had been established, so degrading was the office of wife that women of rank were considered too great to marry. After relating some interesting accounts of certain practices in common with the custom of capture among the Brazilian tribes, Sir John Lubbock says, "This view also throws some light on the remarkable subordination of the wife to the husband, which is so characteristic of marriage and so curiously inconsistent with all our avowed ideas. Moreover, it tends to explain those curious cases in which heterae were held in greater estimation than those women who were, as we should consider, properly and respectably married to a single husband. The former were originally fellow countrywomen and relations, the latter captives and slaves." With the development of the egoistic principle, or when selfishness and the love of gain became the rule of action, the protection of her kindred, which in an earlier age a woman could count on against her husband, was withdrawn, and daughters came to be looked upon as a legitimate source of gain to their families. On this subject C. Staniland Wake remarks, "Women by marriage became slaves, and it was a universal practice for a man who parted with his daughter to be a slave to require a valuable consideration for her. Moreover, as a man can purchase as many slaves as he likes, so he can take as many wives as he pleases." Thus arose polygamy. In Rome, in the latter status of barbarism and the opening ages of civilization, Woman, at marriage, forfeited all the privileges belonging to her as a member of her own family, while within that of her husband no compensatory advantages were granted her. Even a proprietary right in her own children was denied her, and from a legal point of view, the wife became the daughter of her husband, and not unfrequently the ward of her own son. After the power gained by man over woman during the latter ages of barbarism had reached its height, the family was based not on the marriage of a woman and a man, but upon the power of a man over a woman and her offspring, or upon the absolute authority of the male parent. In Rome, a man's wife and children were members of his family, not because they were related to him, but because they were subject to his control. At this stage in the development of the family, the father had the power of uncontrolled corporal chastisement and of life and death over his children. If it was his will to do so, he could even sell them. Indeed, a son's freedom from paternal tyranny could be gained only by the actual sale of his person by his father. Relating to the control exercised by the father over his children, it is observed that he had the right during their whole life to imprison, scourge, keep to rustic labor in chains, to sell or slay, even though they may be in the enjoyment of high state offices. If a father granted freedom to his son, that son was no longer a member of his family. That, with the exception of force, there is no quality in the male constitution capable of binding together the various individuals born of the same father, is apparent from the past history of the human race. Mr. Parkins, referring to the character of the Abyssinians, observes that the worst point in the constitution of their society is the want of affection among relations, even though they be children of one father. He says that the animosities which keep the tribes in a constant state of warfare do not exist among the offspring of the same mother and father, but as the children of polygamous fathers are more numerous than own brethren, fraternal affection is a rare thing. A comparison between the family group under archaic usages at a time when women's influence was in the ascendancy, and the Roman family under the older Roman law, will serve to show the wide difference existing between the altruistic and egoistic principles as controlling agencies in the home and in society. A significant fact in connection with this subject is here suggested that, although for untold ages women were leaders of the gens, so long as their will was supreme, no human right was ever invaded, and no legitimate manly prerogative usurped, but on the contrary, all were equal, and the principles of a pure democracy were firmly grounded. Liberty and justice had not at that time been throttled by the extreme selfishness inherent in human nature. Although the processes by which women at a certain stage of human development lost their independence were gradual, they are by no means difficult to trace. The history of human marriage, as gathered from the various tribes and races in the several stages of growth, shows the primary idea of the office of wife to have been that of sexual slavery, and discloses the fact that it was the desire for foreign women who, shorn of their natural independence, could be controlled, which caused the overthrow of female supremacy. As during the earlier ages of human existence the women of the group were absolutely independent of men for the means of support, they were able to so control their own movements. Only foreign women, captives stolen from their homes and friends, taken singly or in groups, could be subjugated or brought into the wifely relation. Indeed, until the systematic practice of capturing women from hostile tribes for sexual purposes had been inaugurated, and the subsequent agency of repression, namely ownership of the soil by males, had followed as a natural consequence, the usurpation by man of the natural rights and privileges of woman was impossible. The male members of the group had not at that time the power to sell their sisters and other female relations, but, on the contrary, defended them manfully against the assaults of hostile tribes. The foreign captor, the wife catcher, was an enemy who was both feared and hated, and upon him were showered the maledictions of the entire group upon which the assault had been made. In retaliation for his offense, the men who had been bereft of a sister must in their turn commit a like depredation. Thus, through the removal of women, the men of early groups gradually gained control of the common possessions at the same time that they were being supplied with foreign wives over whom they exercised absolute control. In process of time, when wealth began to accumulate in the hands of men, and when friendly relations began to be established between neighboring tribes, foreign wives without influence were received in exchange for the free-born women of a man's own clan. Henceforward, a resort to capture was unnecessary. Distant tribes, however, were still liable to attack. Wars were waged against the men, who were sometimes slain, sometimes taken prisoners, the invaders taking possession of the land and compelling the women to accept the position of wife to them. Finally, negotiations were entered into whereby women were uniformly taken from their homes to become wives in alien groups. Later, the Baal form of marriage came to prevail within the tribe. Professor Smith, quoting from the advice given by an Arab to his son, says, "Do not marry in your own Hai, for that leads to ugly family quarrels." To which he adds, "There was a real inconsistency in the position of a woman who was at once her husband's free kinswoman and his purchased wife. It was better to have a wife who had no claims of kin and no brethren near to take her part." Under earlier conditions of the human race, women, as bearers and protectors of the young, were regarded as the natural landowners, hence they did not leave their own homes to follow the fathers of their children. The woman who left her own relations for the Hai of her husband could no longer exercise control over the possessions of her own gens, neither could she at a later period inherit property from her kindred for the reason that her interests were identical with those of her children and her children belonged to another clan. As property could not be transferred from the group in which it originated, she was disinherited. Through marriage, women gave up their natural right to the soil and consequently to independence. A knowledge of the facts connected with the origin of the institution of marriage reveals the fact that women lost their influence and power not because of their weakness, but because they were foreigners and dependents in the homes of their husbands. The statement was made at the beginning of this chapter that the origin of marriage and the establishment of the family with man at its head involved the subject of economies. When property began to accumulate in the hands of men, when women were forced to relinquish their right to the soil and thus to become dependent on men for their support, their slavery was inevitable. Later, when through the exigencies of the situation, woman went without protest to the home of her master, there to become a pensioner upon his bounty, her slavery was complete. In process of time, women bound to foreign tribes by the children which they had borne, began to accommodate themselves to the situation, and even to claim an interest in the home of their adoption, whereupon friendly relations began to be established between the tribe of the mother and that of the father. Hence may be observed the fact that the maternal instinct was the agency by which the barriers between unrelated groups were gradually broken down, and by which a spirit of friendliness was established between hitherto hostile tribes. As the coherence of the group and the combination of the gentes to form the tribe had been possible only by means of this instinct, so the confederacy of tribes to form the nation was accomplished in the same manner. The change from female supremacy to male dominion is among the most important of the evolutionary processes. From the facts underlying the development of human society, and especially those underlying the two diverging lines of sex demarcation, it is evident that evolution does not proceed in an undeviating line toward progress. It is perceived that seeming retrogressions always involve a gain which could have been accomplished in no other way. Among the benefits derived from this change in the positions of the sexes was the development of altruism in man. When fathers began to take an interest in their own offspring, to care for them, and to become responsible for their welfare, an important step had been taken toward the establishment of the principle of brotherhood among mankind. The evolutionary processes indicate a constant tendency toward the solidarity of the race. They may be said to represent a resistless force, ever drawing the human family together in a closer bond of union and sympathy. Under female supremacy, combination or association of interests was confined to the gens. The extension of these interests, which resulted from the new order, was necessary before humanity could proceed on its onward course. These changes could not have taken place under the early system based on the supremacy of women. The facts brought out by scientists going to prove that the progressive principle is confided to the female are accentuated by those connected with the origin and subsequent development of marriage and the family. That within the female lie the elements of progress is clearly indicated not only in the position which the female occupied among the orders of life lower in the scale of being, and during the earlier ages of human history, but also by her career as a slave of man. Simply by means of the characters developed within the female constitution, without material resources and deprived of recognized influence, women have been able to a certain extent to dignify the family and the home. It is more than likely that in the not distant future, even the institution of marriage, through which women have been degraded, will become so purified and elevated that its results, instead of being a menace to higher conditions, will constitute a continuous source of progress and a promise of still higher achievement. Before this may be accomplished, mothers must be absolutely free and wholly independent of the opposite sex for the means of support. Marriage must be a co-partnership in which neither sex has the right to control the other. Although our present system of marriage took its rise in the practice of forcing women into the marital relation, it must be borne in mind that it was not inaugurated for the purpose of establishing monogamy. On the contrary, the privileges of the captor remained the same within his tribe as before the foreign woman was stolen. The theft was committed for no other purpose than to augment the hitherto restricted range of sexual liberties, and to give to the father absolute dominion over the individuals born in his house. The system of marriage in vogue at the present time has never restricted men to the possession of a single woman. Monogamy, as established under male supremacy, means one husband for one woman, while a man may have as many women as he is able or willing to support. As women are still dependent upon men for the necessities of life, the supply of the former is regulated by the demands of the latter. Marriage still retains its original meaning and significance, namely the ownership and control of women. With the exception of physical force, all the ceremonies, customs, ideas, and usages of primitive marriage have been preserved. When a woman marries, she is given to her husband by her father or some other male relative. She promises to obey her master and accepts a ring as a badge of her dependence upon him. She relinquishes her own name and family, accepting as her own the name and family of her husband. She follows him to his home, where, as she is supported by his bounty, she is subject to his will and pleasure. Until women are economically free, they will remain sexual slaves. Of all the forms of human slavery which have ever been devised, there has probably never been one so degrading as is that which has been practiced within the marital relation, nor one in which the extrication of the enslaved has been a matter of such utter hopelessness. The present struggle of women for freedom shows how deeply rooted is the instinct which demands their subjection. The descent of women has encompassed the lowest depths of human degradation, but the end of the long and weary road which she has traversed is nearly reached. Already the evolutionary processes which are to release her from bondage are in operation. From available facts relative to the development of early mankind, it is certain that it must have required centuries upon centuries of time to subjugate women and bring them into harmonious relations with men while occupying a position of sexual slavery. First, physical force. Second, dependence. And third, the substitution of masculine opinions for the instincts and ideas which are peculiar to the female constitution. This accomplished, the processes were begun which were to rivet the chains by which they were bound, and by means of which women themselves, in their weakened condition, were to acquiesce in their own degradation. Religion was the means employed. Apollo, according to Greek mythology, issued an edict declaring the man is superior to woman and must rule, and Athena herself finally accepted the edict. Through religion, women came to regard themselves simply as appendages to men, as tools or instruments for their pleasure and gratification, and as possessing no inherent right either to liberty or happiness. Religion has its root in sex. As we have already seen, the creative force has ever been regarded as masculine or feminine according to the relative importance of the two sexes in human society and in the reproductive processes. So long as women's influence and power were in the ascendancy, the mother was the only recognized parent. She was the creator of offspring. Later, the abstract idea of female reproductive power was manifested in the female deities. It required thousands upon thousands of years to subdue women. It also required millenniums to dethrone the female deities. When, with the rise of male power, man began to assume the role of parent, he assumed also all the functions which had formerly belonged to women. As has been noted in another portion of this work, he even went to bed when a child was born. With this change in the physical relations of the sexes, the creative principles soon began to assume a masculine aspect. Male deities began to appear associated with the goddesses. In process of time, as male power increased, the god idea became wholly masculine. The Jewish god is a personified idea of male power and reproductive energy. This subject will be referred to later in these pages. Thus, the ancient plan of government, which was the outgrowth of the free maternal instinct and which had guided humanity on its course for thousands of years, finally succumbed to a system based on physical force. When we remember the conditions surrounding early society, we may well believe that civilization was gained, not because of the fact that male powers succeeded in gaining the ascendancy over female influence, but in spite of it. Given a combination of circumstances involving the supremacy of the lower instincts in mankind and the individual ownership of land, the subjection of women, monarchy, and slavery, with all their attendant evils, namely poverty, disease, crime, and misery, were sure to follow. When we consider the fundamental bias of the two diverging lines of sexual demarcation, it is not perhaps singular that the strong sexual nature which has prompted males to vigorous physical action should for a time have gained the ascendancy over the higher qualities peculiar to females. Yet the material progress achieved under the inspiration and direction of agencies like this will not, in a more enlightened stage of existence, be regarded as embodying the results of the best efforts of human activity, or as representing the highest capabilities of the race. Probably no one will deny that the accumulation of wealth by individuals and the subsequent change in the relative positions of the sexes were necessary steps toward the establishment of society on a political or territorial basis, or toward the breaking up of kindred groups and the acknowledgment of the idea of the unity of the entire human family. Neither will the proposition be contradicted that the evils attending these changes, namely monarchy, slavery, and the inordinate love of gain, have been unavoidable adjuncts to the development of the race. Yet, who will doubt that under higher conditions, as the animal recedes in the distance, these blots on the records of human history will be regarded not as regular steps in the advancement of mankind, but as bypaths which, owing to the peculiar bias which had been given to the male organism among the lower forms of life, the human race has been obliged to take in order to reach civilization. End of section 9.